Hi, I'm Mike Ferguson, and welcome to another in a series of policy webinars by Baker Hostetler. I lead Baker's federal policy team here in Washington, D.C., where we provide clients with comprehensive government affairs and public policy consulting services. Today, we're going to pivot from policy to talk some politics. It's an election year, and specifically, we're going to talk about the November midterm congressional elections coming up later this year. We're joined today by independent election forecaster and campaign prognosticator, Jim Ellis. Jim founded Ellis Insight, where he provides political analysis to a series of Fortune 500 companies, including helping to guide their political action committee contributions. Jim was a featured speaker last month at our Baker Hostetler 29th Annual Legislative Seminar here in Washington, where we had several hundred clients from around the country come to Washington to participate in our seminar. Jim did a great job updating our clients on the status of the 2018 elections coming up. So we wanted to invite him back to participate in this webinar for our clients and friends of the firm. Welcome, Jim. Thanks for being here with us today.
Well, thank you very much, Mike. It's a pleasure to be back.
Jim, let's start off with the state of play in the Senate. We'll talk about the House in a little while, but let's talk about the Senate. We'll talk macro first and then drill down to some of the specific races. But currently, Republicans hold a narrow majority, 51 seats, but a favorable map for Republicans as they head into November. Can you explain a little bit about what that means when we talk about a favorable map? And can Republicans possibly even expand their Senate majority, or do Democrats have a real chance to take back the majority in the Senate this year?
Well, certainly the favorable map really is, as you all know, senators have 6-year terms, and every 2 years, a third of the Senate comes up. And in this particular class features a lot of Democrats who are defending their seats, and that's because the Democrats had a good year in the Senate races in 2012. So this group is back up in their 6-year term. And so we have now 35 Senate races instead of 33 because there are 2 special elections, one in Minnesota and one in Mississippi because of resignations, Al Franken in Minnesota and Thad Cochran in Mississippi. So we now have 35 Senate seats up in this election cycle. The favorable map, or the problem map rather, for the Democrats is of the 35, they have to protect 26 seats. So to put it in sort of sports terms, they have to go 26 and 0 in the states they already control, and then begin to pick up the 2 seats they need among the Republican states, which you see in red on the screen, for a majority. And their chances of doing that are very, very slim. Now, it's better than it was because of that Alabama special election that went to the Democrats. This actually opens the door for the possibility of a Democratic majority that really didn't exist before that. Because on the board, there's really 2 seats that the Democrats have a fair or even chance of picking up: Senator Dean Heller in Nevada and the open Arizona seat, which both, I think most everybody would agree at this point, are toss-up elections. That's not to say the Democrats win both, it's to say they have a chance there. So they have to sweep both of those. One will not do it for them to get to 51. But the key is winning all 26 of the current seats that they defend. And in 10 of those, we've got real competition. So I think their chances of doing that, going 26 and 0 of their seats, is poor. And that, therefore, we should be in a situation, because this is a favorable map for Republicans, that Republicans should be able to gain seats in this election. And that would defy normal trends in the first off year of a new president. But it is very possible this time, and actually should happen.
So, Jim, let's just hypothetically for a second look at what the map, what the election cycle might look like if this map were different. You have President Trump's low approval ratings. You have very high intensity amongst Democratic base voters right now. You're seeing that in some of the primaries and some of the special elections. If this map were not so favorable to the Republicans, there would be a real opportunity for Democrats.
Well, come 2020, the map is going to switch, and the Republicans will be in the opposite position where they will have to defend the majority of seats, the vast majority, just like they did in 2016. But to go back, really, in terms of the primary turnout, I'm not The media context of this is all that this is a surge for the Democrats, but really, when you look at so far what we've seen in the dozen or so primary states, that necessarily hasn't happened. I mean, so far it looks to me like more of a normal turnout in primaries for this year, and in the states that typically vote Republican, like Indiana and Ohio and Georgia, more Republicans than Democrats have voted. In the states that typically vote Democrat, more Democrats than Republicans have turned out in the primaries. Last week in California, of the 7 House districts that the Democrats have targeted, that early in the cycle they were saying, well, these are basically slam dunks for the Democrats. In 6 of the 7, and these are all Republican seats now, more Republicans than Democrats turned out. And in the special elections that they talk about with the Democratic surge, yes, there is a Democratic surge. And in the last 4 special elections, we've actually seen more people vote in the special election than in the previous midterm, which is unheard of. And yet it's happened in the last 4 elections. But Republicans have still won 3 of the 4. So yes, you've got increased Democratic turnout, but the Republicans so far are matching that.
So let's talk about some of those individual races. Democrats are defending 10 incumbents this year on that map. That map we just saw a moment ago with all those blue states where Democrats are defending incumbents this year. 10 of those are in states where Trump won in 2016. We have a list of those on the screen now. Someone even told me recently, tell me if this is wrong, that 5 of those 10 are in states that Trump won by double digits.
Yes,
which
that is true, and you see those.
That's a big win.
Yeah.
Is this really a test of vulnerability among Democrats? In other words, just like in President Obama's off-year elections in 2010 and 2014, when Democrats suffered big losses in Congress, is it realistic to expect Republican congressional candidates to do well in 2018 just because Trump did well in 2016? It's not necessarily a given that Trump's voters will also turn out in an off-year election when he's not on the ballot. Is that right?
Yes, that's absolutely correct. And in fact, history shows us that for both parties, that tends to happen, that you actually have a decrease in turnout with the party that has won the presidency. So in the modern era, which I define as from President Harry Truman to today, we have a situation where in a president in its first midterm, his party has always lost seats in the House, but that has not been the case necessarily in the Senate races, even in the same elections, because we have seen the president's party actually gain seats in that first midterm. So the Senate doesn't seem to follow the same pattern as the House. But in all cases, the party with the president in the first midterm since Truman has lost seats in the House. Now, it is skewed to some degree because the Democrats have lost a lot more than Republicans. And what throws the model off, and you can look at 2 different models, since 1970, it's been the average loss for both parties has been 33 seats in the House in these particular elections. If you take it back to Truman, it's 26. But there is a big partisan difference, because if you take just the 6 Democratic presidents, the loss is tremendous because of 3 elections. In 1966, LBJ lost, the Democrats lost 47 seats. 1994 with Clinton, they lost 54, and 2010 with Obama, they lost 63. So those numbers have really kicked the average off, and I think it's out of kilter. If you look at the 5 Republican presidents, and we take Gerald Ford out of it because he was not elected, the average loss is 15 seats, and that includes Ronald Reagan losing 26 in 1982. So there is a big difference in terms of who is in the White House or which party is in the White House, which tells us about the turnout patterns of that party.
So looking at our chart on our screen right now, we can see those 5 circled double-digit Trump margin victory states. Are they the most likely Democratic held Senate seats this year to flip to Republican, or are there individual circumstances in some of these races that maybe make one or another of these less likely, or maybe one of those closer states more likely? What are your top 3 or 4 or 5 that you think could flip from Democratic to Republican this year?
Of those states that you have circled with the Trump double-digit margin, I have 4 of the 5. The one that I don't think will come through for Republicans is Senator John Tester in Montana. I think the Republican nominee, Tester went on the air the day after he was nominated because he's from Maryland, so they're calling him Maryland Matt, and that's not going to fly particularly well for him in a place like Montana. I think Tester is well suited for his state, and he runs brilliant campaigns. I think that's the one where, of those 5 circled, that I would bet on the Democrat. The rest of them, I think, are pure toss-ups. And the one I would add to the toss-up column from those that are much closer is Florida, where I think Governor Rick Scott and Senator Bill Nelson have been neck and neck for over a year. And I think, the patterns, in fact, there was a poll out yesterday in Florida, and it showed that Scott was ahead by 1 point. But if you look at the segment of the most reliable voters, which are those 50 and over, that lead increased to 4 or 5. And the trends among that group of most likely voters in terms of age, which is the best predictor, favored Scott and the Republicans by a much larger margin. So I think Florida is shaping up pretty well. So on those 5, I think there are 5 in play. I would take Montana out, and I would put Florida in that group. The remainder of West Virginia, North Dakota, Indiana, and Missouri, I think are very much toss-ups at this point in time. The interesting thing on these 10 Senate races, all were carried by President Trump. The other thing to give us an idea on their typical voting history is the other senator from each of these states is a Republican in 9 of the 10 instances. The only exception is Michigan, that sends 2 Democrats. So generally, these states are prone to electing Republicans. So I think the idea that the Democrats have problems on defense is true.
Can you talk a little bit more? The West Virginia Senate race, that's the biggest number on this chart in terms of a Trump margin. It's a big Trump state. He's still very popular there. You have Joe Manchin, the current Democratic senator, former governor, very popular in that state.
Right.
And you have his opponent who came through a tough primary,
He did.
Pat Morrissey, who's in his 2nd term as the Attorney General of West Virginia. What's your best guess on this? This is one of these nationally looked at races.
I think this is one of the more interesting races, and I think it's the one where the Trump margin may not matter as much because, again, as you mentioned, Joe Manchin is the former governor, twice elected. He's the current senator, twice elected. So he's won 4 statewide elections there. But on the other hand, Patrick Morrissey has won 2, and he works very hard. I think the Republicans got the best candidate out of that primary they could have in terms of a matchup with Manchin. Does President Trump come in there and run the state with Morrissey as we get closer to the election? If that happens, then I think all bets are off. And I think the seat's very much in play. But the 42% Trump margin there, that certainly isn't going to happen. If Manchin is to be defeated, and that's possible, it's going to be a very, very close election, I think.
How about in Indiana? Joe Donnelly, former congressman, first-term senator. When he was elected 6 years ago, he ran against a flawed Republican candidate. A lot of folks thought that seat was going to be a Republican seat, and a sort of moderate to conservative Democrat. Joe Donnelly won that seat. He's now up for re-election.
Yes.
Mike Braun, his Republican opponent, beat 2 sitting congressmen from Indiana to win that primary. How do you think that one's going to pan out?
Well, I think my guess is Joe Donnelly probably was not happy with what came out of the Republican primary. I think he would have been much more comfortable against one of the 2 congressmen. Mike Braun ran a brilliant campaign. The way he was able to meld his 2 congressional opponents into one person, doing that graphically and just in terms of showing how similar their votes were, and used the swamp theme against them very, very effectively. Now, he won the primary, but he only had 42% of the vote. So another way to look at that is 59% of the Republican voters did vote for a member of the swamp because they voted for one of those 2 congressmen. I think Braun would have been defeated had one of those 2 House members run, but they didn't. So he comes out of that with 42%. I think he's a pretty good matchup for the Republicans against Donnelly. I think we've got a real strong race here. Indiana was one of the strongest Republican states in 2016 from top to bottom. And so we'll see if that pattern continues. It normally votes for Republican, but it did go for Barack Obama in 2008. So they do have an independent streak from time to time, but normally they vote Republican. So I think the toss-up rating is correct for that race.
So one more on this chart is Missouri. Claire McCaskill,
Yes,
who is a moderate Democrat, has been representing Missouri for some years now. She's actually been very effective in drawing the best candidate for her to beat in her previous races. She had, again, a flawed candidate, Republican opponent several years ago. And, there's a little bit of chaos going on in the Missouri Republican Party. We just had the Republican governor resign from office in a scandal. How is that one going to work out?
I think if you look at the straight numbers in terms of how Missouri's been voting, to me, this should be at the top of the list because McCaskill's vote, particularly in the last couple of years, has been out of kilter with the rest of the state. So, but the way the race is developing and you consider the campaign abilities of the candidates, Josh Hawley is going to be the Republican nominee. He is the Attorney General. McCaskill has already been prepared for this because Hawley ran on the theme when he ran for Attorney General in 2016 that he carried a ladder around with him and had it in his ad saying that he was not going to just use this position of Attorney General as a stepping stone to another office. Well, what does he do with his first opportunity to run for another office is he takes that. And so she will absolutely have strong ads and use that against him. And Mike, I think you're correct. The scandal with the governor who was forced to resign, Josh Hawley as the Attorney General was in the middle of that, helping to bring charges that were later dropped against the governor in exchange for him resigning. And I think that's a no-win for him because he's taking hits from the media and the Democrats saying he wasn't tough enough on the governor, Eric Greitens, and he's taking hits from the Republican base saying he was too tough. So he was in a no-win situation on that. I think he is fortunate that that situation is now over. Greitens is gone. The Republican lieutenant governor now is in the governor's office. And I think as we get closer to the election, a lot of that will be forgotten. Hawley needs to have regular turnout and a regular trend, and he probably wins. But McCaskill is one of the tougher people the Democrats have in terms of campaign ability, as you mentioned, and I think it's very much up in the air. But I would rate this is actually a little bit lower than we might have several months ago.
So let's flip it to the other side of the equation for the Senate. The Republicans are defending at least two seats that a lot of folks think will be competitive or they're vulnerable in. One is in Nevada, where Dean Heller, the incumbent Republican, former congressman, now senator, is running for re-election in a state that seems to be becoming more Democratic every election cycle. And in Arizona, where you have Jeff Flake, former congressman and senator, who's now retiring from office. So Republicans need to defend a Senate seat there. What do you make of those two states where Republicans have some vulnerability?
Well, the primary in Nevada is today, as a matter of fact, and Senator Heller is fortunate. He does not have primary opposition. He was going to, with frequent candidate Danny Tarkanian, who then, and I believe President Trump had something to do with this, talked him out of running for the Senate and got him into the House race instead. This is a big plus for Heller, not to have Republican opposition to him today. The Democratic candidate will be Congresswoman Jackie Rosen. She is a freshman, so this is her first run, and she is also virtually unopposed in the Democratic side. So the two of them are going to square off, and this is Heller is opposed. Congresswoman Rosen is out of the Harry Reid machine that still exists, even though he's no longer in office. And this will be a tough race. As you said, on paper, Nevada tends to be going to the Democrats more. Hillary Clinton won that by a fairly good chunk. But in 2014, the Republicans swept it from top to bottom. And the reason was the turnout was abnormally low. The Democrats simply didn't vote. That certainly they cannot count on this time. So this is going to be a very tough race. But as you said, Heller was elected in 2012 with Obama on the ticket and with Obama carrying the state. Plus, he was elected several times in the House, and he was the Secretary of State, so he won statewide in that for that office, I believe, twice. So he's no stranger to a statewide office there in Nevada. And I think this is going to be a pure toss-up all the way to the election, and it is solely dependent upon turnout. Arizona, there's a lot of conjecture that the Republicans are actually in better shape without their incumbent running. Jeff Flake's national feud with Donald Trump hasn't played well for Flake. It is the only time, I think, in my recent memory anyway, that I can remember a candidate or an office holder in particular having worse approval numbers within his own party than he does with the electorate as a whole. So now we go to a primary situation. The Democrats are pretty well set with Congresswoman Kyrsten Sinema. She's a 3-term member from Phoenix and will be very, very tough in the general election. Arizona is not what it was for Republicans years ago, but it's still Arizona, and the Republican nominee should be the favorite, particularly if it's Congresswoman Martha McSally, who is the first woman ever in the history of the United States to fly a combat mission for the United States Air Force, and she's the first woman ever to command a squadron for the Air Force, a flight squadron, which is a really very good profile for the state of Arizona. That should sell quite well there. I think the Arizona race may be the best campaign in the whole country this year in terms of the quality of candidates and the type of campaign they're going to run. You have to view it as a toss-up, but again, I will bet, if I had to bet, I would bet Republicans to hold that one in the person of Martha McSally, as long as she's the nominee. She does have primary opposition. The former Sheriff Joe Arpaio, and a former state senator, Kelly Ward, who held John McCain to 51% last time. But the fact that the two of them are in there taking the right and splitting that should allow McSally to come through.
So we'll try to do a lightning round on 2 more Senate races. I just want to get your quick thoughts because, of course, we do have a lot of House races. The entire House of Representatives up this year. We want to talk about that. But my home state of New Jersey, we have an interesting situation. It's a pretty generally inhospitable place statewide for Republicans, but we have a Democratic incumbent, Senator Bob Menendez, who's coming off a hung jury at a federal corruption trial. The Senate Ethics Committee chastised him for inappropriate conduct. His numbers generically at home are pretty bad. There was a Fairleigh Dickinson poll recently that showed him only getting 28% of the vote against a largely unknown Republican challenger, Bob Hugin, who's got a lot of personal resources that he's been spending and will continue to spend in that race. Is New Jersey really is it fool's gold for Republicans, considering the macro environment and President Trump's low approval ratings there, or is this a sleeper race that people should watch?
I think it might be too early to tell. It normally is fool's gold, and this is a state where Republicans tend to poll better than they run. I've seen the pattern in the South where Republicans tend to run better than they poll. But in New Jersey, I always use as the opposite example that you often see some polls such as this one that shows a race being tight, and then in the end it's not. This one may be a little bit different. I saw that poll that you were referring to from Fairleigh Dickinson, and I really didn't believe it because, so first of all, both candidates were low on support. It was 28 to 24, which seemed awful low to have decided support. But my guess is the question, the way they used it was to screen for the hardest core vote for both candidates. So that would explain the low numbers for both. What surprised me was his poor approval rating among Democrats, Senator Menendez, who was only 51. I didn't believe that. I said, I think there must be a flaw in the poll, although the rest of the poll looked methodologically sound. Then the primary comes last week, and he only gets 62% against a person who literally just put her name on the ballot and spent no money. That, to me, verified what the Fairleigh Dickinson poll was saying, that he does have a problem with Democrats. Now, whether that translates into them not voting for him, I doubt. Will it translate into these folks maybe not voting in that race? Maybe. And that's the big unanswered question. You're correct in that Bob Hugin does have a lot of personal resources. He's already invested $8 million into the race. He hasn't even spent half of that yet. So he's not known now, but by the time we hit November, he will be known. And I think it's too early to tell whether there's a chance here or not.
So lastly, let's talk about runoff races in the Senate. Election day on November 6th might not actually be the end.
Might not be the end. If it comes down to one seat, the seat in Mississippi, and we mentioned there are special elections, and Minnesota and Mississippi are handling their special elections differently because we have senators leaving in the middle of the term. Both replacements have to run here to serve the balance of the term. So they're both up in 2016, and they'll both again, or whoever wins these races will be up in 2020 because that's when the seat normally comes up. Cindy Hyde-Smith has been appointed in Mississippi. She is a Republican. The way Mississippi is handling it, all of the candidates running for the office, and there are three major ones, her, former Agriculture Secretary and Mississippi Congressman Mike Espy, he'll be the Democrat, and then you have a state senator by the name of Chris McDaniel, who almost knocked off Senator Thad Cochran in the 2014 election. And so that becomes a problem for Cindy Hyde-Smith. So all the candidates go on one ballot in November, concurrent with the general election. If no one gets a majority of the vote, and that's likely, then they're going to go to a runoff 2 days before Thanksgiving. And if we're down to a situation where this seat could determine the majority, and that's possible, then we could be in for an interesting time right before Thanksgiving. So there will be further campaigning almost assuredly between November 6th and November 27th.
So we're going to pivot. I want to talk about House elections and those prospects, but I want to remind our viewers and callers that if you have questions, be sure to log in and put your question in so we can ask Jim when we finish talking about House elections. We look forward to getting to questions from our audience. Let's talk about the House a little bit. Republicans have their second biggest House majority since World War II. But as with any large majority, there are factions within this majority. It kind of undermines the leadership's ability to advance an agenda. We also have the added dynamic. Speaker Ryan has already announced he's not running for re-election, which tends to weaken the hand of the leadership of the majority when they're trying to corral everybody moving in the same direction and be on the same page, at the same message as they get into election season. Tell us a little bit about what you think is going to happen in the House.
Well, I think the House is really interesting, and I think it's probably going to dominate the news coverage because this is the Democrats believe they have a strong chance. They need technically 23 seats. I think realistically it's 24 because there's a seat in Pennsylvania that is going to come back to the Republicans. It's now an open seat. So it is, if you look at the country, and I like to say, if you listen to a lot of the media and the commentators they have on there, it's basically a fait accompli that the Democrats are going to win the House. In fact, Charlie Cook, a known political prognosticator here in Washington, has said just last week that he thinks there's a 70% chance that the Democrats will take the House. I disagree with that completely because I don't believe what we're seeing in the actual numbers. Now, not the polling, but the actual numbers of people voting, to me, for what I've seen, does not verify this building blue wave that they talk about. And I think it can be capsulized by just running through the country and say, what does 24 seats mean? What do the Democrats actually have to do? And I don't believe this is spin, and it's not analysis even. It's pure mathematics. And so I'm going to start in Maine and come right back to the rest of the country. You start in Maine. The first thing the Democrats have to do is beat Congressman Bruce Poliquin. He won by 9 points. Then they come back into the tri-state area of Pennsylvania, New York, and Mike, your home state of New Jersey. Out of that group, they need at least 5 seats gain, a 5-seat gain. They could actually do that all in Pennsylvania now with the redistricting. 3 targets in New Jersey, at least 2 in New York. So they probably need to do a little better than 5, but they have to do at least 5. When they come to Virginia, and they have to beat Barbara Comstock, who won by 4, even though Trump won by 10. Then in the following states, all these states, they have to net a gain of 1 seat. North Carolina, Florida, Texas, Kansas, Nebraska, Iowa, Illinois, Michigan, Minnesota, Colorado, New Mexico, Arizona, and Washington. They have to win 1 seat out of every single one of those states. Then they come to California with their 7 targets, and they have to win 4. But they're not done. because they have 8 of their own seats that are in play where Republicans could win. There's 2 open seats in Nevada, 2 open seats which are very problematic for them in Minnesota, where the Democratic incumbent won both of those seats by less than 1%, and neither are running for re-election. So those are open seats. Then they come to New Hampshire with the seat that's defeated more incumbents than any state in the country. Incumbent's not running, so they have to hold that, which is, you never know what New Hampshire is going to do. It's been the biggest swing state we have now since the turn of the century. Then there could be developing races in a Connecticut open seat, a Pennsylvania open seat, and an incumbent situation in Arizona. So all told, that's 8 seats. They have to win all of those. So from the time I started talking in Maine until now, the Democrats have to do everything I said, 100% of what I just covered. And if they do that, they get a 1-seat majority. So that is their minimum. So it is difficult. It's not the fait accompli that people are talking about, because that's still a difficult situation. And regardless of what Trump's numbers may be, or what the generic polls say, these are district by district elections, and individual candidates matter. And they still have to defeat Republican incumbents generally in Republican seats. So I think it's a tough road. Is it possible? Yes. Is it probable? Today, I don't think it is probable.
You mentioned both Pennsylvania and California, and I've been reading that there are big opportunities for Democrats in those 2 states.
Yes.
Pennsylvania because of the new map mandated by the state Supreme Court, and California just because it's California. A lot of Republican retirements there and some key districts. Aren't those 2 states possible big winners for Democrats?
They have to be. They have to be big winners, and if it doesn't happen there, then the majority doesn't happen. I think originally in this cycle, I thought California would be the base where it would tell us what was going to happen in the majority. I do think now it's the tri-state area instead of Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and New York. But those are the 2 areas we need to look at for Election Day, and if the Democrats exceed their goals, which in the tri-state is 5 seats, in California it's 4 games, then they probably are coming back in the majority. So, but the Pennsylvania map is much more competitive than the old map, but it yields toss-up seats. So this assumes that the Democrats win every toss-up election in those states. And as we know, toss-ups are 50-50. So the chances of them, I think, sweeping the toss-up races are probably not going to happen. I think the chances of that happening are slim. You look at the turnout in California, as I just mentioned earlier, in those 7 races, in the primaries where they talk about a surge in turnout for Democrats, 6 of those 7 seats, more Republicans voted in the primary than Democrats. So I think that's a much better sign.
Let's talk about President Trump's approval ratings and disapproval ratings on some of those swing districts, those toss-up seats. I used to represent one of those districts in New Jersey that they frequently talked about as a toss-up district, and you'd be in trouble again this time. I know, and I know full well the impact that a either popular or unpopular president who's not on the ballot can have, the impact that can have on a midterm election. In a lot of these districts, President Trump's ratings are going to be a real drag on Republicans. Since 1970, the president's party loses on average, as you mentioned before, 33 seats in midterms when the president's job disapproval rating is higher than 50%. And when you look at President Trump's disapproval rating in his 18 months in office, his disapproval rating has never been below 50% nationally in the country. Isn't that alone a sign that Republicans could be facing some massive losses, particularly in these so-called swing districts?
Well, it could be. It could be, and it's interesting because I noticed there was an article out today, as a matter of fact, that talks about how, Trump's numbers are actually better than President Obama and President Reagan at the same commensurate time in their presidencies. And that was viewed as, this is going to be actually a positive thing for Trump. But in reality, in the succeeding election, both of those presidents took a drubbing at the polls, which indicates maybe it's not such a good thing that that's the case. Conversely, though, I'm not sure these approval numbers and where Trump stands with numbers is relevant, because he defies all of these patterns of numbers. let's go back to the day he was elected. His approval number was 38 to 40%, and he wins the election. And they're better than, and his actual numbers are better today than they were on the day he got elected. So I'm not really sure how we read that. Or is he such an anomaly that his numbers are going to be irrelevant? Probably too early to tell, and we're going to need this election to really answer that question. You know, the other point, too, is on the Republican House, keep in mind as well, as you mentioned, this is the second largest majority in the post-World War II era for Republicans. In the last election, 2016, that entire year, the Republican Congress never achieved a 20% approval rate. Yet they won the second biggest majority they ever had in the modern era. I'm not sure those numbers correlate to what's going to happen this year. But unfortunately, to tell, we're going to need the election to happen.
Jim, you mentioned a little while ago voter intensity. I may have raised it, and you commented on it. Let's talk about that again for a second. You know, there's some cross currents out there right now. On the one hand, we have voters who are more than twice as likely to vote for a congressional candidate who would be a check on Trump, otherwise, in other words, a Democrat, than more likely to vote for. They're more likely to vote for a congressional candidate who would be a check on Trump rather than one who would be a supporter of him. Does that translate into election results?
Well, it could, and I think on the next slide we'll see too that for the Democrats, you know, Nancy Pelosi seems to be a drag. And what does that? And it's almost the same percentage that would be less likely to vote for a Democrat if they knew Nancy Pelosi was going to return as the Speaker. You know, what that tells us, where we have these two polarized answers, is that this is going to be a turnout election and not a persuasion election. So the battle is which side can turn out which side is better at turning out their voters in this election. That's going to be the determining factor. I don't think most people are going to change their minds on how they view things, but it's a question is who is better motivated to vote and who will actually turn out.
And that's what we're seeing on our next slide here. You know, we have Democrats who, as I talk to them here in Washington, they want to run against Donald Trump, and they talk about President Trump every chance they get. Very interesting, though, because Republicans have someone to run against, too, because Nancy Pelosi is very, very well known nationally. She's, you know, loved by the Democratic base and sort of reviled by the Republican base. And because of her very high profile, Republicans are talking about her as much as Democrats are talking about President Trump out on the campaign trail. So it's a very interesting cross current that we see here. You know,
I'm not sure if we've ever seen one that's this stark either and this polarized. So that tells us that neither side is going to change their opinion, and further evidence that we've got a turnout election as opposed to a persuasion one.
So, Jim, thank you for all of that. We're going to get to some of our questions now, and one I want to ask is about foreign policy. Obviously the news has been dominated these last few days by the president, both at the G7 and now in Singapore with the summit with North Korea. Traditionally, foreign policy, it's kind of tough for foreign policy to have a big impact on elections unless it's something quite substantial.
Like we're in a war.
Exactly. If we're in a war or there's a terrorist attack of some sort, we've seen how those can influence domestic politics and domestic elections. Do you think the president's performance at the G7 or with the North Korea summit, or frankly, you know, we have several months to go before the election, could there be another international or foreign policy development that could impact the elections?
Yes, it's hard to say right now, particularly with the North Korea summit just ending. We don't know how that's going to be viewed. My guess is it's way too early to tell, and so much is going to happen between now and Election Day that it's difficult to predict. I mean, the electorate changes so fast now because in reaction to things. So a lot could depend on what happens in that very week of the election or that very month with so many states having early voting. People vote early now, so it's really more of a month of elections as opposed to Election Day in a lot of places, the majority of places. But Yeah, I agree with you, Mike. I don't think foreign policy has been much of a vote-determining factor unless we're in a war. I mean, it certainly was in the 2006 election when the Republicans took a drubbing and lost the majority, and that, I think you could directly relate to the Iraq War. But beyond that, it's usually economics, followed by social issues, and then maybe some foreign affairs occurrence.
So let's talk a little bit again about some things going on here in D.C. We have a number of folks, obviously, who follow politics more closely here in the Washington area, Washington, D.C. area. And the chatter amongst some Republicans has been that their sort of numbers have been on the uptick a little bit in these last several weeks, whereas, at the beginning of the year and obviously through of last year, the very controversial and sometimes unpopular president's going to be a big drag on Republicans in the midterm elections. Republicans, some that you talk to around here, are sort of heartened by an uptick in some of their generic numbers. Does that really translate into election results as in your experience?
No, particularly not the generic on the House races, because again, we're talking about 435 individual races. Most of those generic polls are national polls, where you have maybe, if you're lucky, 1,000 respondents to those polls. And most of those people are very likely coming out of the suburbs and the cities as opposed to the rural areas. So I don't think it's a good picture of what happens in a House race, which are more localized and the candidates matter a lot. And the incumbent retention factor in the House is so incredibly high, well over 90%, even in a bad year. So it is, and you look at the open seats, there's a lot of them, there's 63. So you think, gee, Democrats have a good chance to win those, but most of those are safe seats on both sides. And I think for the Democrats to win the House, they're going to have to defeat a lot of incumbents. And that's difficult to do in House races. I'd argue it's the most difficult thing to do in American politics.
So continuing with our questions, you just mentioned open seats. By my count, I think there are at least 59 districts, congressional districts in the country that are not going to have an incumbent.
63.
63 will not have an incumbent who's running for re-election. First of all, to what do you attribute that big number? I mean, that's a pretty big number.
It's a very big number, and we've had big numbers since the 2010. We had 63 in 2010, but that included 20 new seats from reapportionment. Then it went to 47, 48, and now again 63. That's huge turnover. And again, we are seeing the least senior Congress that we've had in the modern era. We have a majority of House members. I think I have to chat now. I think the number is right around 240 House members who have served 3 terms or less. And in the Senate, I think you have 71 senators who have served 2 full terms or less. So we've never had numbers like that. And we're going to have it again because we're guaranteed of 63 new freshmen, and that's if all the incumbents win. So it's again going to be a huge freshman class, and it's the open seats are where you can generally make changes. Most of these seats are in safe districts, though. What do I attribute it to? I think there's just satisfaction with the difficulty of the job, the fact that nothing is moving and very little is moving. It's difficult for both sides. It's, as you know personally, it's a difficult lifestyle. And you also have, on the Republican side, you have an abnormally high number of members who are chairmen. I believe 9 of those members who are committee chairmen whose term limit is up. And after you're a chairman, as you know, it's hard to go back to being a rank and file member. So it's usually better to get out, and most people do at that point. So I think it's a combination of factors. And of those 63, 42 are Republicans. So the Democrats have 20 of their own. One is that new seat that's created in Pennsylvania. So it is a very large number. But again, the vast majority of those seats will remain with the party that they currently are in.
So we have time for one more question. We talked a lot about some of the individual Senate races. I want to get your thoughts on what you think are either the most interesting 2 or 3 House races in the country, and maybe this is the same answer, who are the 1 or 2 Democrats or 1 or 2 Republican incumbents who are running for re-election who you think are just dead in the water, who are the most vulnerable of the
that's a good question.
incumbent House members running?
Well, I think you have to look at Pennsylvania because the playing field's changed, and so you've got a lot of people vacating. I'm not sure there's anybody, frankly, right now who you would say, oh, they're for sure loser, but there's an awful lot that are in highly competitive toss-up races. You would have to first look, actually for both sides, you look for the new 17th District of Pennsylvania, the only district in the country now where you have two incumbents running against each other. The Republican Keith Rothfuss against the new Democratic congressman who won the special election, Connor Lamb. Now, because of the change in map, this affected him too, because the seat that he should be running in is way more Republican than the one that he just won by 700 votes. So he thinks his chances are better coming over to this Pittsburgh area seat and running against a three-term Republican incumbent than running in that open seat. So in a way, the two of them might be the most vulnerable incumbents because for sure one of them is going to lose. And this seat is a dead even toss-up seat, maybe tilts a little bit to the Republican side, but that's about as close as you get. There's another seat in Pennsylvania I find very interesting too. The Charlie Dent open seat in the Allentown, Bethlehem area. This too is another seat that is pretty much down the middle in terms of how it votes, but this one tilts a little bit to the Democrats. But you've got the Republicans have nominated, I think, one of the more interesting candidates I've met this year, Marty Nolstein, who is an Olympic gold medal winner. He won in cycling in the year 2000 Olympics, and he's a county commissioner from Lehigh County and was the top vote getter in the whole county when he ran, and he's one of the more impressive people I've met. So there, I think you might even the scale where the district tends to vote a little bit more Democrat, but I think the Republicans have a superior candidate with him, and the Democrats had a war in their primary where they had a candidate that the national people thought was too conservative, and they went in with firepower and air cover and defeated him in the primary to nominate a candidate who she's not run for. Well, the one time she ran for office, she lost. She is the city attorney of Allentown, but that's an appointed position. And the man that supported her for that, the mayor of Allentown, is headed to jail because he was convicted on bribery charges.
Wow.
So that might even the score a little bit more. So I think that may be one of the more interesting races we'll see. And then you have to look at the California seats as well as for some very tough competition from top to bottom. I think the category, though, where you see, on my count, I've got 20 toss-up races. I think right now, if I had to choose, I think the Democrats win 12 of those. And if you look at, but the real key category is I've got 40 seats that lean Republican. And this is going to determine where things fall because the Republicans are going to have to win at least 3/4 of those, and that's going to be a tall order.
Jim, this has been a fascinating discussion. We're going to have you back in October sometime, just before Americans go to the polls to get your updated thoughts. So thank you again to Jim Ellis of Ellis Insight. Again, I'm former Congressman Mike Ferguson at Baker Hostetler. I lead the firm's federal policy team. We provide clients with comprehensive government affairs and public policy consulting services. If you have questions, you can reach me here at our Washington office at 202-861-1500. That's 202-861-1500. Thank you again for joining us in our series of Baker Hostetler policy webinars. This one, of course, was on politics. We'll contact you again soon about our next upcoming webinar. And until then, good afternoon from the nation's capital.